Oh, kia ora, Heidi. Thank you for coming to talk to us today, all the way from Copenhagen. And for those who've just joined, it's 10 o'clock at night for Heidi. So we're really lucky that she was able to or considered presenting at this late time. But thank you very much. And we're really looking forward to your topic. And I think it's a really important contemporary topic in this day and age. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning to you. And I think I will just go into screen share. So actually, I'll see you at the end of my talk. I have a few slides, not many, but I'm going to stop my video and go to screen share. Like that. Is that working now?
Yep.
Yeah. So in this drawing, the artist Banksy has dumped the superheroes as we know them in the bin. Instead, a little boy is depicted lifting a doll dressed in a nurse's outfit up high in a gesture of admiration. The ongoing COVID-19 crisis has made often underappreciated human efforts and societal structures visible. The celebration of care workers is just one example. So my talk is entitled Architectural Care, Caring Democracy. While it's provoked by the COVID-19 crisis, care ethics and practices is an established field of study, and my talk draws on ongoing work and is in part delivered, or was in a keynote for the Live in Art conference in Turkey in 2019. At that time, I was postdoc at Kajita Stockholm. I'm now assistant professor at University of Copenhagen. In Denmark, where I speak from, the 20th century welfare politics still have their bearings on the structural organization of housing, childcare, education, and health. Structures that the recent events have again made visible for appreciation, as governments has guided and instructed us citizens to socially and physically distance ourselves. We've understood that we all play part in sustaining the balance of capital growth and social processes, a balance that we often leave unnoticed. Meanwhile, the inequalities produced by the neoliberal push on the welfare system are also becoming ever more visible. The COVID-19 crisis has not only directed our attention to working conditions of healthcare staff, it's also raised global awareness of systemic racism and an overall democratic crisis. During lockdown, some people are shielding in overcrowded flats with no escape to common services or workplaces, out of sight. Some may have waited and waited in telephone queues to reach out for support. Support workers may on this occasion have worked from a make-do workspace at home. Meanwhile, other people flee in private jets to private islands with personal doctors and perfect digital interfaces. But even here, global roars reach the news. It takes deliberate efforts to stay blind to the fact that distribution of space matters to communities' well-being. Globally, stocks continue to change hands, and locally construction sites are for most part still in business. Capital investments continue to underpin welfare services. Architecture and planning technologies have historically been used as tools in socioeconomic restructuring. Think of slum clearances and the orchestration of private and public spaces managed to hide squalor and advance democratic engagement. With the recent agreement to renovate social housing in Denmark, the government seeks to accelerate the Housing Association's central revolving fund for building industry. The social housing sector is to generate jobs, higher green standards, and make a push for more resourceful residents. In my research in the field of architecture, landscape, and planning, I focus on social housing and the distribution of use value. From the outside, the Nordic housing model is sometimes seen as a bit of a supermodel, recollecting a decency and a collectivist mindset that once ensured fundamental needs and the rights to housing for all. But in recent decades, the financialization of housing has rendered such solidary values near invisible. The expertise of architects and planners have increasingly been turned to render housing as object for speculative investment. I question how architectural expertise can embrace the caring aspirations of Banksy's young child. In this context of social housing, I borrow Banksy's idea of replacing the old-time superheroes, all-empowering authority and expediency, with new social aspirations. So in line with feminist scholarship on care, I question how we might think of architectural work, not as technologies that only advance capital growth, but as work that sustains communities. Care is in line with Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, seen as, quote, potential to disrupt the status quo and to unhinge some of the moral rigidities of ethical questioning. In the context of architecture and planning, such disruption can serve to unhinge techniques for new social purposes. During field work in one of my cases in Sweden, I worked in this room, once the storeroom for a shop on a small town housing estate. This room was now community space for the organization Peace. The members of Peace had repurposed the shop for play, coffee and tea making, extra prayer space, space for washing hands and feet before prayers, and more. Caring with this community means to find possibilities in given premises and to take off your shoes for work. Political scientist Joan Tronto proposes that democracy become more caring and that caring become more democratic. Her project asks us to rethink how we associate practices with prestige and power. In a pluralist and relational framework, she defines care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. From this broad perspective, care is not a naturally motivated disposition or effective connection with another person or group. Rather, it's a technical term for the complex, skilled practices for addressing the needs of others. Now, as Tronto points out, most activities do not happen at this most general level. Specific care practices are nested within other care practices. So mobilizing these ideas about a kind of nested care practice in architecture and planning, I lean on Nancy Fraser's notion of material and immaterial labor of community social reproduction. Care labor, Fraser describes, is the unpaid production involved in maintaining households and broader communities, say informal childcare, housework, gardening, or DIY. People's social relationships may be central to most architecture and planning communities. But people's lives don't really matter in the logic of financial assets. Further, the object-centered rationale that determines architects' work with housing is normally tied to an ethos of certainty and finite specifications. The temporalities and varied practices of communities' care labor is a hard fit in architectural business as we know it. Yet we have for some time acknowledged the social agency of architecture. The changing welfare state models exploited this potential of architecture as a technology that translates and stabilizes societal ideas and norms. To orientate architecture towards care then means both to make architectural work more caring and to integrate care labor in a spatio-economic program. The local shop, now community room that I just spoke of, is part of this mixed typology housing estate. First designed by Ralph Erskine architects through the 1960s, it models a critique of the infamous standardized housing blocks of that time. Yet, Erskine's scheme was, like other multifamily housing, also sanctioned by the post-war welfare states and their extensive building norms and regulations. Erskine's tweaked top-down regulation into what has been termed human architecture. These idealized spaces are today reorientated by those who live, use, and appropriate the buildings and landscapes. Iad, Chair of Peace, describes his community space like this. I think the space is very important because from here we can reach people that no one else can. We, as a community association, speak their language. We know the culture, and this means we can speak to people, understand them, and how ideas influence them. Iad cares at eye level and identifies the importance of a common language to sustain and maintain communities. The shop had been closed for 20 years before being leased to the community association that act as a platform for new suites. This community gathers people around different activities, including prayers, as they find that religion gives this place more continuity. What draws the predominantly Muslim community together doesn't immediately align with the culture of welfare state administration. But as the CAO of the Housing Association points out, residents associations and their meeting spaces have been important instruments also in the democratic organization of Scandinavian welfare housing. This particular building has a public character. The location, its civic facades, sizes of rooms, the detailings of the entrance and windows and so on. The shop, once iconic of the welfare state's community model, now supports a large group of immigrants that, despite being a majority on this particular estate, would normally be considered minorities in the public realm. Particular communities do care, being it through hobby, childcare, commercial or religious activities. In Toronto's address to architecture, she tells us, quote, care emphasizes processes and relationships that extend back and forward through time. It starts from responsibilities to care not only for the object, this thing or its creator, builder, or patron, but for all who are engaged in contact through this thing. To no one's surprise, a caring mode of practice entangles spatial dimensions with democratic decision-making processes. But how do architects make social processes their business? Care is a modest call to do, think, practice in the midst of things, that is to take active part in the making of the world. The point of architectural care is to support communities because when caring seems a part of people's ongoing life together, they feel safer and pay more attention to the environment. They may seem this may seem as common sense to people involved on some level in care work, being it parenting, community work, or teaching, but the care should extend into the capital and financial logics that architectural practices are at service to is less obvious to most. Our first challenge then is to make care labor visible to expert gazes of architectural and planning communities. And secondly, as architects and planners operate through expert languages and techniques, one question that arises is how to mediate between communities and architects' practices. Architects Josh Boyce and Julia Dwyer suggest to blur normative definitions of what they sort of ironically name proper work. They describe, quote, a form of intellectual labor based on what Sarah Ahmed calls sweaty concepts. And then they quote Ahmed. A sweaty concept might come out of a bodily experience that is trying. The task is to stay with the difficulty, to keep exploring and exposing this difficulty. Not eliminating the effort of labor becomes an aim, because we've been taught to tidy up our texts, not to reveal the struggle we have in getting somewhere. So the point is to not tidy up. In my ongoing research project, Impossible Instructions, I speculate on ways to inscribe use value in architectural design processes by reactivating historical experiments that challenge this sort of proper architectural work. Erskine, in example, continuously pushed the boundaries of traditional practice. As this archival record reveals, Erskine's mainstream housing design service is also an endeavor to ensure such service rendered is fairly capable of action realized through close collaboration with both householders and clients. The point of acting with communities that he makes here aligns architectural practice not only to fixed products and managerial systems of mainstream architecture, but also to inhabitants' differentiated material practices, languages, and histories. So I end this talk where my current work begins with a call to mediate between experts and local communities, languages, and techniques. And in a way, I sort of ask, how do we embed gossip in architectural specifications, sweat in offices, make local development plans do the triple work of recording pasts, engaging the present, and projecting futures? Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Heidi. That was fantastic. Unfortunately, Zoom's not very good at showing appreciation, but if people can do a clapping reaction, that'd be great. Cool, thank you. Okay, so yeah, if people would like to ask a few questions, that would be fantastic. You can do it in two ways, either by turning on your camera and putting up your hand and I'll try and look for you, or just putting raising your hand in the chat. I think that's through reactions as well. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, any questions?
Can I start just the ball rolling? Thank you so much, Heidi. My name's Sophie, for those who I can't seem to change my name on my my Bogomon community ID, but yeah, I'm interested in the superheroes because I'm interested in how I'm noticing, especially in these last weeks, how the people that we consider to be, in a way, failed heroes, very much of leaders of international powers, are failing, and yet others, they're still remaining in some people's eyes as heroes. And I'm interested in this kind of cleave that's occurring between the veneration of some, whilst we rapidly discard the original. So I'm wondering if you kind of sense this too, from your perspective, that there are that the hero still will exist for many people.
Yeah, I guess that's so. I think the heroes exist, and to be fair, somewhere I guess our appreciation of the care workers, this hospital staff, is fairly short-lived, I imagine. So this is not a new, it's not a new problem that care work is underappreciated. Care work that is not just in the kind of sort of healthcare area, but care work that, as I talk about, is part of all of the work that we do when we engage in communities and in the well-being of each other. So I don't think, I think to turn things upside down for a while does make us aware of a need to shift kind of who we appreciate or how we appreciate each other. And I think the idea of kind of treating care as a sort of superhero action is maybe a drive to exaggerate an underappreciated kind of area of work. So one has to kind of push a bit extra, but really what would be great is if we reach a sort of norm where, the school teacher earns the same as the banker, where architects who engage in community dialogues, have the same weight in practice as the architect who has the client dialogues, for instance. At the moment, there are all these sort of hierarchies sort of set up, and also work has been very kind of fragmented and divided into these sort of expertise areas. So I think with the kind of idea of cross-pollinating these different expertises, maybe there's a little bit of a superhero in all of us.
Heidi, can I ask a question? I was really taken with your point about how you were starting to talk about sweaty concepts, which I thought was an intriguing idea. And then you went on to talk about how, we're encouraged not to reveal the struggle of getting to a sort of, at least a point in time, which can be conceived as being finished. And it sort of strikes me that the whole of the design, built environment design professions kind of really major on that sparkly finished look. All the architecture competitions are very much about, showing images with millions of people in them and, enjoying the space or whatever. Did you have any thoughts about how we might subvert that system to encourage people to to reveal the struggle along the way?
I think we need to do it. I think one place to start is in education. So architectural education is very much geared towards projects that are good and projects that are successful, and not projects that are trying things out. And I think a lot of the kind of culture and practice starts already at that level. Then there's another kind of debate going on about the possibilities of saying no to work. So saying no when you meet sort of conditions that you don't feel are ethically all right. But at the moment, that's very much a kind of judgment made sort of from practice to practice. We used to have a kind of duty of care as part of our professional frameworks that's been omitted because of the difficulties in dealing, legally with the duty of care in the sort of grey zones of architecture. And but I think to sort of I guess my idea is to kind of is both to kind of address how we think of the purpose of our profession and the ways we do things, but it is also to, in a way, sort of infuse or inflect ways that we work. So the kind of techniques that we use, the written work that we produce, the drawings that we produce, very much for kind of technical documentation, but that the same drawings can operate and function very differently depending on who you have a dialogue with. So if you in a contractual agreement are asked or obliged to speak to local communities, for instance, then you can make that work that you submit for a contractor, you can make that work socially as well.
Cool. Pip, would you like to ask your question?
I have a good morning. I have a 2-year-old next to me, so it's easier to. Thank you so much, Heidi, for giving this talk. I'm a design student looking at changing the gender norms for families for care. Yeah, and I'm interested in how do we change the systems and wondering if you have any ideas about where we can begin there, because we need bigger change, not just at the individual level. Yeah, so I was wondering what thoughts you had on that.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm interested in is the sort of professional framework and the duty of care, and then I'm interested in the kind of the plans of work which currently operate sort of quite linearly, in a way where you write a brief and then you do the design, and in those sort of sketch design, and that involves different sort of dialogues. This is kind of very diagrammatic way of saying things, and then you have a period where you design or produce building information for a contractor, and at that point you have very little kind of contact with a broader community. I think in a way what needs to be done is to think much more circular about this sort of ways of working, so that you that you kind of mix the different stages of assessment of the various kind of criteria that you are assessing when you're working in this sort of system of practice. Within that, I know that there's been, for some years now, work done towards a kind of contract with slow landing, so where you negotiate how, say, a building is received or is used over a long period of time, and not merely sort of how it's taken over, a bit like the way you buy a shoe, and if it's broken you can hand it back, but that you actually give a period of time for people to settle, because we are kind of renovating more and more compared, ideally, rather than a new building. I think some of those processes will happen kind of naturally. That doesn't mean, though, that care would necessarily kind of be valued. So I think for that to happen, I think there's a point of just sort of making visible how care and community care works in sort of in sustaining long-term the communities. And I know there's sort of different references where local, like where developers say have been working, private developers have been working with local communities because they understand that the kind of importance of keeping residents. Some of those sort of movements are happening. So I don't think it's like an altogether alien idea. However, it's, as I said before, I really think that if you want to sort of overall kind of make this change, sort of structural change, I think it takes education. I think it takes professional frameworks. That's sort of, I think, where you can sort of operate within the profession. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions?
So I'm just thinking, Pip, that maybe your question also goes sort of more broadly as a sort of, on a societal level. And I think for that, Toronto's proposal is quite provocative. It doesn't sort of provide a straightforward solution, I think. But I think that might be something to look into. And it's, of course, it's part of it's a feminist movement. So that's also a point about just, letting other people who are not usually in power be part of the sort of decision-making processes.
I also, I really like that phrase of hers, that we want democracy to become more caring, but actually caring to become more democratic. And it's something I'm going to bring up this afternoon when I introduce the next chunk of speakers for the rest of the day. This idea that community has to somehow, this is Norte Mares, he's a student of Latour's, who talks about political community, and that essentially, rather than just wildly complaining about things that are going on, we actually have to we bring ourselves together. We may not belong already to the same community, but if we are affected by a particular affair, is how he puts it, they must form a political community if the issue that affects them is to be dealt with. So it's this idea that actually we almost have to improve the level of structural thinking within care societies too. Would you say so too, Heidi?
Yes, I agree that to lift the eye level from the kind of parochial trap in a way, that so that you do engage with structural forces as well, I think is crucial. But I think also there's a point to the sort of notion of the nested practice, where I think it's important to acknowledge that we are not all, politicians, and so small change, gets picked up by, communities with bigger efforts and who are at a moment, or people who are at a moment in their lives where they can carry more for others. I think that sort of idea that you're not always the caregiver, you're also the care receiver, for instance, I think is an important, like that kind of reciprocity, I think, both within yourself, but also, in relationship between kind of different scales of actions in a way. But I agree it's really important to kind of recognize the different scales of action, because of course care labor is very much a sort of structural issue that needs to be dealt with.
Cool, thank you. Any final questions? Okay, all right. Well, we might leave it there, but thank you very much again, Heidi, for your really thought-provoking talk. And it'd be great to follow up to see if we could get some of your writing too. I'd love to read more around this. So thank you for staying up late for us, and we really appreciate your contribution to the symposium today. And thanks to Sophie for having you as a contact. So, but yeah, at 1 o'clock we have another, I think, 5 speakers. So do join in again then. We've got Jade Kake, Sophie, Hannah Hopewell, Fiona Hillary, I think, and Tamitha Paul, who's a counsellor here in Wellington. So yeah, there. I hope I haven't missed someone. I may have, but anyway, it will be worth joining in at 1 to listen to them as well, and we can forward on the recording, Heidi, so that you can get some sleep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Awesome.
Oh, great. Pip's asking to read your work as well. Heidi, do you have some writing that you might forward to us, or references we could look up?
I have one paper coming out soon on kind of writing and drawing care.
Okay.
So I could send that to you, but I'm not sure I can distribute it yet. So I just need to hear, but it's to be published quite soon. If it's particularly on the issue of care, I think that would be nice. The paper that I spoke from today, I haven't published yet. I'm still working on that.
Sure. Okay. Great.
But yes,
Okay.
maybe I'll forward Sophie. I'll send something to you.
That'd be great. Please do. Yeah.
And maybe then you can distribute. Okay.
Sure. So the notes you gave me, I will just keep, in the unpublished file.
But I presume that it's Pip asking who's working with the norms around care in family life. I presume she has read Silvia Federici, for instance, but she would be an obvious reference.
Sure. Yeah, she's obvious. I don't know whether care is really spoken of yet widely. No. I'm afraid we're a few years behind Heidi. In this, we have. I mean, Becky might be able to speak to more of this. We have ideas of manakitanga and kaitiakitanga, which are coming to us from Maori concepts, right, of care for others and for. Well, you can speak about it, Becky, better than I. I suppose I feel like we have a very strong understanding in New Zealand of these concepts from an Indigenous perspective, but how they are aligned with the mainstream, the Pākehā institutional teaching is yet to, I think the balance is yet to be found. And that's why it's important for you to share, I think, what is quite standard discussion now in Europe about care.
That would be interesting to, if you have some references, to read a bit into that, I think. Yeah, I'm working on another paper called Utopia with a colleague of mine, Jennifer Mack, where we are sort of writing about women's care labor and effective labor in the Swedish post-war landscapes of these housing estates. So that would be, coming out, but things like that takes forever. So unfortunately, I can't share this either. But the reason I say this is that with the literature we've used there, we're sort of starting to discuss how, a lot of this comes from a sort of Italian context because it goes back to Silvia Federici, and then we were just sort of discussing how important it is to actually sort of ground these discussions in our kind of nation state or local area kind of structural frame. So again, this sort of, what we just talked about, different kind of structural mechanisms in a way that operate seems to be quite crucial. So I think it'd be really, really interesting to learn, about the sort of local culture. I think maybe that's where you should start rather than starting from the, the more kind of generic theory.
But I think with a lot of architectural education, particularly in New Zealand, still referencing Europe and the States, it's important also for us to familiarize people with feminist teachings, because I don't think we're getting a lot of that.
I think architects are, I don't know if I can, then they just, architects were not the first people to pick up feminism, were they?
No, definitely not. I mean, I've just come from geography, actually, where there's a very strong group of feminist geographers, and they talk a lot about the ethic of care up there. So it's quite interesting to come to an architecture school and have that comparison, I guess. But I think I'd just be really interested to explore what that does mean for the New Zealand context. And I actually wondered at one point about trying to get some research money for a project focused on monarchy cities, was the title I was thinking about, monarchy being this notion of hospitality, and given that Māori have almost been forced to be hospitable to colonial forces, well, not almost, they have been forced to be hospitable, we have been forced, but what does that mean in this day and age, to show monarchy in cities?
There's one good book that you might like, if I can find it. So this one from last year.
Critical care. Okay.
So it's a collection of essays, and I refer to, Toronto to keep things simple. Essay where she addresses architecture in this book. But it also has a collection of sort of case studies, and so the book documents an exhibition that the kind of architectural foundation. I'm sorry, I forgot. Architekturzentrum in Vienna had on last year, where they kind of curated all these different programs from around the world. So I think if you're sort of interested in, what a built environment looks like when care has sort of been part of the process, I think that's a really interesting reference. I think they sort of, it's not all the practitioners that have come to the conclusion themselves that it's care work they're doing. It's curated in a way where they're sort of trying to form a discourse around this notion. But it's very interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you. I probably need to head off to my next meeting. But thank you again, Heidi, and thanks, Sophie. And hope to catch up with you again, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice to meet you all.
You too.